So it's been a couple of weeks since my last update on the Thorns Minions Necromancer, and I've since made quite a few tweaks to the build to really optimize it to not only make it do even more damage, but also become a lot safer as well, now using a shield along with Bone Storm, and also rocking a very low cooldown on Invulnerable using Blood Mist, giving you not necessarily the highest pit pushing or fastest farming build ever compared to especially some of the other classes, but it does very well for the premise of a Thorns build. This is a very chill, safe, and laid-back playstyle that can farm virtually anything in the game like a breeze, even relatively high pit tiers as well. And this holds arguably even more true with the changes that have come with the mid-season patch. First of all, nerfing the Holy Bolts elixir, which this build doesn't necessarily have to rely on anyway, although with the bug it was able to sort of cheese its way to higher levels of the pit, but the same is true of virtually any Necromancer or Minion Necromancer build, right? So that's definitely an okay change in my opinion, and a healthy change. And second of all, in the pits, they've actually somewhat rebalanced the difficulty, making boss health a little bit more forgiving compared to the rest of the dungeon. And since the Thorns build happens to excel at the pre-boss portion of the pit, a nerf to the bosses is also a very welcome change. And with that, going over the major changes I've made to the build compared to my last video, and of course a character planner will be in the description box below as well if you want to go into depth on everything. But first of all, I've swapped from a two-handed scythe to a one-hander and a shield. I'm using a wand. You can also use a dagger for a bit more close damage or damage to close enemies, but Lucky Hit is nice too if you want to proc your Decrepify to lower cooldown. So I've opted for a wand. It doesn't really matter too much because your weapon damage doesn't help Thorns, which is your main source of damage. And with this, I'm gaining one extra aspect slot, right, by swapping from or out of a two-hander. So with that, I've also changed back from Army of the Dead into Bone Storm, and so I've taken the Bone Storm aspects, being the Ultimate Shadow, as well as the Shielding Storm, which by the way also got buffed with this patch, giving you barrier according to your max life instead of base health. And I've swapped out the Army of the Dead aspect to put Blighted on my Choker for more damage compared to having it on my weapon. Aside from that, most of this is the same. I have the Needle Flare aspect, so I'm not actually running the increased attack speed aspect, which is the aspect of Frenzied Dead. I've actually sacrificed the aspect of Frenzied Dead and instead opted to go for as much attack speed I can take on my gear, right? So namely my gloves, my rings, as well as my amulet. All of these pieces have attack speed right now, and also minion attack speed on my weapon as a temper, because by stacking these, you want to get to 100%, right? Or as close to 100% as you can to be able to benefit from the legendary Paragon glyph or Paragon node called Cult Leader, right? And this actually caps at 100%, so you're actually able to hit 100% or very close to 100% just by using gear or affixes without using the Frenzied Dead legendary aspect. And since I've shifted damage away from my golem into just going balls deep into Thorns, I don't need that extra attack speed past 100% anyway, right? If you look at my stats though, I will not have, as you can see, 80 or 100% attack speed. I'm only at around 75-ish or a bit less than that. This will actually, of course, go up as I masterwork my gear further, and especially if I get a proc on any of my attack speed rolls. But what I've been doing is, since especially the Elixir of Holy Bolts has been nerfed anyway, I don't have to use it. And instead I can use Elixir of Advantage, which will give me an additional 15% attack speed, which if I chug it, I'll have around 67% base attack speed plus 22% minion attack speed, which will give me very close to around 90% bonus attack speed, which will allow me to almost max out Cult Leader just through that, right? Of course, if my gear is a little more optimized, and if I get more masterworking done, I'll be able to get even closer. Again, without having to use the aspect of Frenzied Dead. Aside from that, the rest is basically the same. I've also added in the aspect of Plunging Darkness to allow my Bone Prison to spawn a pool of Blight. So with that, I've also swapped out of casting Blight manually and into Bone Prison to essentially give me on-demand vulnerable as well as cooldown reduction with Bone Prison, which is very helpful, and also still be able to benefit from the effect of Blight, or rather Supernatural Blight, which will give me even more multiplicative damage too, right, to enemies within my Bone Prison. And aside from that, the rest is pretty standard stuff for the Summoner Necro. I have, of course, all the Thorn stuff, same as before, Razor Play and again Needle Flare. For the minion stuff, I have Reanimation, Blighted I just talked about, the Bone Storm stuff I just talked about, and then I have Occultal Minion for extra warriors and mages, and then I also have Hardened Bones, this time on my helmet. And then another aspect that I have is the Explosive Mist, to not only allow my Blood Mist to trigger Corpse Explosion, which I actually have the Blighted Corpse Explosion to be able to deal shadow damage over time, and without having Corpse Explosion on my bar, I can still cast it with Blood Mist. So kind of the cool thing with the setup is I have 2 extra skills essentially. Blood Mist kind of doubles as 2 skills because it can also cast Corpse Explosion, and then Bone Prison also doubles as Blight, right? Because especially since I also get Supernatural Blight, which is huge. But for this Explosive Mist aspect here, it's honestly kind of a flex slot. For example, you can go with the... For example, you can also consider going with Blood Getter's aspect for even more damage, which I've considered as well, but I actually prefer the safety from lowering the quota on my Blood Mist, and I think the consistency from triggering Corpse Explosion to trigger my Blight is arguably about the same damage or maybe even better damage than using Blood Getters. There are some other ways to play around with this. For example, you can even swap out your pants for like Blood Moon Breaches to take the Crepify off of your bar and gain some damage reduction. But after thinking about it, I don't think it's that worth it because I would lose 2 tempering slots, right? And that would give me less utility, such as Blood Mist cooldown reduction and the Crepify size that I would lose. Shaco might also be another option for your helm, but the plus skills doesn't actually help much if at all because it doesn't add to your passives. The damage reduction is certainly nice, but another major change I've made here is to get Skeletal Warrior Mastery, and I have greater affixes here as you can see on both my helm and my boots. And I've also opted for Skeletal Mage Mastery on my pants. If you want, you can also get it on your gloves, but I currently have Maximum Life, which I think is quite nice as well. Skeletal Mage Mastery is not as helpful as Skeletal Warrior Mastery because your warriors are the ones that are getting hit more and thus proccing your thorns, right? Where mages are less likely to be hit, although they will be dealing a bit more damage. And the reason that plus the Skeletal Warrior Mastery is so strong here, especially if you can get greater affixes and also get the Masterworking procs on them, and it's that with each point that you add to this, you get an additional 15% damage, and this is a multiplier to not only, of course, the Skeletal Minions melee damage, but more notably, the Thorns damage that they'll be dealing as well, right? So it's just a really great way per point or per affix to gain damage, and especially since you can get these on sort of relatively defensive or utility type pieces, right? And so they're not taking away from your offensive pieces or the affixes on your offensive pieces because you can get them actually on your helm and your boots. And of course, you can also optionally take Skeletal Mage Mastery on your pants as well as gloves. With the pants also not typically being an offensive slot, but being one of the only ways to gain additional offense on these defensive pieces aside from having intelligence, of course. And one more minor change that I made was I swapped from a lot of damage to cursed enemies, which I still have 1 right here, to damage to close enemies, because the roll on that temper affix is actually higher than damage to cursed. And with how much more tanky I've become, I am in fact able to just stand very close to enemies much more consistently than before, hence this damage to close enemies affix, right? One sort of exception though is on certain boss fights, you might want to sort of dodge away from the bosses or move away from them to avoid certain mechanics, in which case you might want a more even mix of damage to close and damage to curse. So for example, if I were to do this again, I might opt for like 2 damage to curse rolls and then go for damage to close for the rest. And by the way, for a lot of this new gear, such as my new Razor Play and some of the Skeletal Warrior Mastery stuff, I used a website called Diablo.trade, which in my opinion is extremely helpful in finding items that have specific affixes that you need and even greater affixes. And what I did was I would go and look for more recent listings and just mass whisper a bunch of people, and I actually got a lot of replies for people who were down to trade with me. And not only that, I was able to sell some of my own items as well to make a lot of gold to support that. So I would highly recommend utilizing that website, which has saved me a lot of time and just allow me to target the things I need very quickly. And by the way, I did do a tutorial on that trade website, and it's an approved site by Blizzard. You can actually log in with your Battle.net account, it's completely safe to do so. And anyhow, I'll link that tutorial in the description box below for you to check out. And just showing you some gameplay real quick. Again, this is an extremely safe build, especially going back into Bone Storm. Essentially, you just want to initiate with your Decrepify a couple times depending on how large your radius is. Turn on Bone Storm, essentially run in, use your Golem to taunt, and you can also cast Blood Mist pretty aggressively. Or if you want to play even more safely, say you might actually be in a bit of danger at super high levels of hits, you can even alternate between Blood Mist and also your Golem taunt, which will of course allow you to stay super safe. And you definitely want to also use your Skeletal Priest from time to time to keep your minions topped off and also to gain a slight multiplier of damage as well. With the amount of cooldown reduction granted from Decrepify and also Bone Prison this time, you should have very high uptime on not only Blood Mist, but also decent uptime on your Bone Storm as well. So that's yet another reason that this build is super duper safe. And against bosses, it is a little bit hit or miss depending on the boss that you face. The Outlaw Sharpshooter is by far the worst one to face because it just has less opportunity to proc Thorns. But the ones that have like swing attacks or cleave attacks and are able to hit multiple of your minions at once will allow you to just deal more damage to them typically. And if you even are tanky enough to stand close to the boss as well, when they hit you, you'll also reflect a bit of extra damage to them as well, so that could of course help. But essentially what you want to do is very similar to your regular rotation, is to cast Decrepify and refresh it when you need to. Cast Bone Prison, I basically do it on cooldown, and while I might initiate a fight with Blood Mist just to get the Blighted stacks going or Shadow Blight stacks going, I usually hold off on my Blood Mist a bit more, especially past 50% HP, where the bosses are more likely to spawn like one-shot mechanics like with Lilith. I tend to try to hold off my Blood Mist for those types of mechanics. As you can see here, I didn't do that, and I was killed by the Lilith Echo because I got greedy and used Blood Mist more offensively, even though my damage on the boss was actually pretty good and my bar was still like in a pretty good spot, but I actually wasted the death and time because I got greedy casting my Blood Mist, right? So I definitely don't recommend using Blood Mist that much and saving it for like the actual echo mechanics. And with how tanky I am though, I find that I am able to tank most if not all the boss's regular abilities, save for like a couple of like more the obvious avoidable mechanics. I of course will try to avoid them. And with the echoes though, you do need to kind of know how to play around them. You need to know what they are, but as long as you learn them and avoid them, and this is true of basically any build in the game, right? Because most builds will get one shot by these like red echo mechanics unless you're like a super health stacked barbarian or whatever. So as long as you learn those mechanics and also hold off on your Blood Mist, you should be fine. And of course, I'll try to use Bone Storm and stand close to the boss to benefit from the damage to close enemies when I can. I'll use Taunt pretty frequently, but not usually on cooldown because when the boss is staggered, you're not able to deal Thorns damage to them. So I kind of just use the Taunt from time to time, especially if there are ads that are spawned by the boss. I'll be more likely to use the Taunt there. But using it will allow you to stagger the boss, which arguably will allow you to play even more safe as well. So that's kind of an optional thing. And with that, that's pretty much all I wanted to showcase with this update to my Ultimate Thorns Minions build. I can't really think of any way to optimize this further, of course, other than just getting better rolls on my gear and just having more greater affixes, although gear will be getting very much more expensive as I go into that, so I just don't think it's that much worth my time. But for what it's worth and for the premise of a Thorns build, I think I'm quite satisfied with its power level, how easily it can sort of trivialize and farm stuff, albeit not necessarily at the fastest pace compared to some speedy builds. But I've definitely had a ton of fun with it so far in Season 4, and I would recommend it if you would like to try it out. Even though it's not really on any tier list that I've seen, it definitely, I think, can compete with, or very closely with, some of the top tier, at least Necromancer builds right now. So with that, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I'll definitely reply to your comments. And consider subscribing to my channel as well for more cutting edge videos just like this one. And I will catch you in the next video. Peace.